Good morning. My question is, how do you see the legacy of the Napoleonic Code as a matter of the development of patent systems and property rights as an inhibitor to the rest of France and the Iberian Peninsula and the Western Hemisphere?
So there's a humongous literature about whether or not civil law systems, like the Napoleonic system, where what you do is you consolidate all the laws, right? And what judges do is look at the code, or code-based systems, versus common law systems like Britain and the United States have, in which what judges are doing is working off of precedents rather than whatever's in the code. There is a humongous literature about this. In 2 seconds, I'm going to digest that literature. The evidence that civil law systems have produced less economic growth than common law systems is not strong. Here's a thought experiment. 18th century, 19th century France, is it poor? Not by world standards it isn't. It's just poorer than Britain. Up until the late 19th or mid-19th century, it's not clear who's going to actually win, right? So it also turns out that all of the so-called mechanisms that should be holding back civil law countries, like difficulty in forming joint stock companies. There's a paper by Lamoureux and Rosenthal on this showing that actually France had more joint stock companies than the US. So the evidence is not strong. What's interesting is, in fact, that regardless of whether countries were common law or civil law, they jumped on patent systems. So Germany is a civil law country. They jumped on the US patent system. France is a civil law country. They jumped on the US patent system. Argentina is a civil law country. They jumped on the US patent system. So it seems not to matter. There's some interesting differences in terms of who develops new technologies. But it's hard to find evidence that one is holding back innovation more than another, or encouraging innovation more than another. I'm going to let, again, the TAs are going to do this. They don't trust me to pick questioners.
Hi, thank you again for talking to us. So my question involves medical patents, specifically the ability for medical companies to extend their patents by altering their product minutely. Do these have negative effects on innovation and kind of public goods, and how does that impact the patent law?
So this is an area of rather intense public debate. So the fundamental issue is that pharmaceutical companies want to the degree they can, extend patent lives on products that already exist. And they want to do it because they want to be able to appropriate the returns to all the money they spent getting a drug approved in the first place. It costs about $1 billion, more or less, to get a drug from R&D all the way through the approval process and get it to market. Given that cost, they want to extend patent lives. What the right number of years is an empirical question. The impetus to go after the drug companies for trying to get extensions, or by issuing a new drug that's only slightly different or that combines two pharmaceuticals before and then take the other one off market, is certainly there. If you took that away, though, you would think of the mechanics of this. One is you would have to increase the cost of the initial drug in order to recoup the cost of developing the new technology, or you wouldn't develop it at all. So the rebuttal to, geez, drug companies or pharmaceutical companies are over-extracting from consumers and are harming consumers. And if you talk to a lot of startup companies in the pharmaceutical or medical device space, they'll say, well, if we can't appropriate the returns to our investment, we're going to get out. We're not even going to get funding. So I was talking recently with a company that's got a genomic-based cure for blindness in children. They said, if without patent rights, we can't operate. We won't get funded. So it's a difficult argument. It's a difficult empirical issue. Where I come down, what hypothesis I would be predisposed to accept is the hypothesis that on net, most pharmaceutical development comes out of a very small group of countries, primarily the United States and Germany. That's not an accident. It's not an accident because those are two jurisdictions with quite strong intellectual property laws. So before we start to tinker too strongly with the patent system, because we think that somehow there's been a negative externality, we ought to ask about, well, geez, what would the world look like if we reduced the incentives to patent in the pharmaceutical space? Would a lot of the cures that we have now for diseases that when I was a child were death sentences, that now are not, that have cure rates of over 90%, would we be willing to pay that price? I'm not allowed to. Apparently my visa does not allow me. I'm a New Yorker, and so I have a restricted visa in California, so they don't let me direct questions. Cesar's got a person he wants to.
Thank you very much. So we're in Silicon Valley. It's a hotbed of startup culture. I think a potential issue that kind of arises in a lot of these startups, their goal is to necessarily try and be bought out, more or less. They're trying to be acquired. Do you see there being an issue with these large tech companies that are just acquiring large amounts of intellectual property, more so because they want to acquire intellectual property and also prevent future competitors from kind of arising? Do you think it's an issue? Do you think it's going to become an issue? More or less along those lines.
I'm going to give a short answer, which is no. This is a hotbed of innovation. And what most startups want to do is get bought, because actually bringing a product to market requires a scale that the startup's not going to have. And so what the startup wants to do is develop a new product or an improvement to a product, and then hope to get bought by a large firm. What's going to happen to the revenues that the investors in that startup earn from selling? What do these guys tend to do after they buy the Ferrari? And they're mostly guys, sorry. But guys and gals, what do? What's the next thing they do after they sell to a big firm? In what? Another startup, right? So you always meet people like they've been part of 9 startups, the successful people. Oh, I've been part of 9 startups. It's like, so what it senses is this is fueling yet another round of small companies that are innovating. So one claim that gets made is that somehow this is blocking innovation, but what you could keep in mind the reasoning here. The counterfactual is that the startup was going to grow into its own company on its own. That's a very, very hard thing to do. The economic history of this is basically as follows. There are people who are very good at innovating. They tend not to be in big companies. They tend to be in smaller companies. Smaller companies tend to be more agile. Big companies tend to be heavily bureaucratized. Big companies have the scale to commercialize a product, but because they're so bureaucratized, they tend not to be as good at innovating. And so the life cycle seems to be small companies do the innovation, big companies buy the innovation, commercialize it, the small companies, the founders of those companies, then start another small company. We have an example of a system that does not look like this. It's called Western Europe, where there's not a strong startup culture, and what you tend to get are large incumbent firms where all the R&D is taking place inside these big firms. And they tend to be much less nimble, and those economies tend to grow more slowly than ours does. I don't think it's an accident that many of the sort of frontier IT technologies are commercialized by American firms, not European firms. So the cost, there's always this argument made about, we shouldn't have these big firms. The cost of preventing them from buying out smaller startup firms would be a lot less innovation, and it wouldn't be that the small firms would grow into big firms. It would be that the big firms would just do everything, and you'd actually have less innovation and less, incidentally, less social mobility. The question.
Thank you so much, Professor. It sounds to me that it's very clear for the development or the economic growth for the US case, the intellectual property is key. So I want to ask from a more international perspective, like for developing countries like India and China, do you think for their economic development, what's the role of intellectual property in the short term and long term?
Let me sort of scroll back to this. It's a great question. Let me scroll back to this graph I showed at the beginning. Okay. I'll go forward one. So one of the questions for developing countries, and we have to be clear here what we mean by developing. So you mentioned India and China. So actually, India and China should be in this graph. Here's China. You see CHN here in the middle above the 25. There's China. In India, right above the 20, there's India, okay? So by the standards of developing, they're actually pretty developed. They're not wealthy countries yet, by any stretch of the imagination. They're not in the top quarter of the distribution. They're somewhere in the middle. For countries, so the country with the lowest GDP here is measured as Myanmar. So does the evidence suggest that if Myanmar tomorrow adopted strong intellectual property laws, that it would increase Myanmar's innovation and economic growth? The evidence for that's not very strong. And the reason is that there's so many things that are limiting growth, of which the intellectual property laws are only one, that you really couldn't sustain the hypothesis that intellectual property is the key problem in Myanmar. There's a lot of problems, of which IP is down the list. When you get to countries like China and India, now it gets a bit more interesting because you see that there's actually a nonlinear relationship between the strength of intellectual property and GDP. It suggests that at mid-levels of GDP, the kick from intellectual property gets larger. And the reason is that you have to attain sort of a moderate level of development to make it worthwhile to invest in intellectual property laws. So for China, this has been a big issue in the last several years. Very early on in development, countries tend to pirate intellectual property. And it's not clear that that's necessarily at very, very low levels of economic development, that's a bad strategy. However, if you look at the very wealthy countries around the world, you notice they tend to have strong intellectual property laws. And it's because to get to the frontier of the frontier development or the frontier of product development, you need to have incentives for people to invest on frontier technologies. They have to be able to appropriate the returns to their investment. So at some middle level of economic development, it now becomes worthwhile to heavily invest. The Chinese actually in the last 5 years have done a big switch in terms of the enforcement of intellectual property within China. So there's been an explosion of patenting in China. And the development of patent courts in China to enforce Chinese intellectual property within China. The same debate is now going on in India, where the courts tend to be quite pro-intellectual property and the regulators tend to be quite anti-intellectual property. The evidence is, from looking around the world, that at their stages of development, strengthening intellectual property rights would allow them to accelerate growth because you would be able to get from, let's say, putting iPhones together in Foxconn to producing a product that can compete with the iPhone as in a Huawei or ZTE phone. That requires intellectual property in order to compete, in order to have some advantage in the market. Not having intellectual property, having weak intellectual property laws would make it very, very hard, in fact, to enter the world market because people just knock off your product, which is what happens now in India. So it depends where you are and what you mean by developing. If you're the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I don't think the first thing you want to do is strengthen intellectual property rights. But if you're China and India, I think the evidence is, yeah, you probably do. Probably have time for one more question, Denise? One more. And then I can hang around and bore you more afterwards.
Hi, I was wondering if you could discuss the Department of Justice's increased prosecution of economic espionage and IP theft, particularly with China. Is this something you're concerned about, or do you think this is purely political or has farther negative ramifications?
So ultimately, everything's purely political. That's a joke. But I mean it in a serious way. There's two ways that we can sort of address distributional issues in any society. One is the market for products, as we refer to as the market for economic goods. And the other is the market for regulation. We call that politics. And both are always operating. So the U.S. in the last several years has become, under the Trump administration, has decided to take a very hard stance on Chinese companies who are claimed to have pirated American intellectual property. Is there evidence consistent with the hypothesis that that's true? Yeah, there's a lot of evidence consistent with that hypothesis. You can go to China and go to an Apple store and buy an Apple phone that's not made by Apple and it's not an Apple store. Right? So yeah, there's like lots and lots and lots of evidence. There's also lots of evidence that Chinese regulators and courts squeeze American companies who are selling into the Chinese market to transfer their intellectual property to Chinese firms and to set the price for it. It's forcing American companies to hand over their IP. So I don't think this is not trivial. Now, the question is it just politics? It's not just politics, it is politics, because one of the questions that's, now step back from the stuff about economics. Think about power. Remember one of the points I made is like, why did the United States win World War II? Because the United States outproduced the Axis. In fact, Germany's decision to invade Russia was made because they wanted to get it done before the U.S. entered the war. Because the Germans knew that once the U.S. entered the war, it's game over. They're quite clear, Hitler was quite clear about it. We need to defeat the Russians before the Americans can enter. Because he knew it'd get buried by American productivity. So the nexus between international power and economics cannot be separated. One of the concerns that the Trump administration has, and my own view is that it's not unfounded, is China's rise and China's claim to wanting to be a global superpower. In terms of the geopolitics of this is a sort of a threat to the international order if you're the United States. And so the response has been, I would advance the hypothesis that the response has been, let us push back on China in places that China is economically vulnerable, IP rights being one area where we can push back, but it's not the only area. The tariffs can also be understood in this light. Let us try to debilitate the Chinese because what's at stake is a kind of the geopolitical balance of power. I think there's quite a bit of evidence that that is in fact what's going on. So it's not just politics, it is politics with a capital P, because it's very hard to disentangle property rights, economic power, and political power. They are tied up intimately with one another. Trying to take them apart would be like trying to unscramble an egg. But here's what we do know, and here's where I want to leave you guys, because Denise has given me this look like you need to shut up.
Wrap it up, not shut up, just wrap it.
Yeah, I know. I'm from New York. We're much less polite. I'll tell you a joke about that in a minute. I won't tell them about the, never mind. So if you think about, if the concern for the point of view as policymakers is to maintain U.S. geopolitical strength, then the weakening of property rights that took place roughly from about 2006, which I want to be clear, precedes the Obama administration. This is not a D versus R issue. From about 2006 to roughly about 2016-17, put the U.S. at a geopolitical disadvantage. Thank you very much.